Good morning. I will speak as a witness of the last 2 decades which saw the development of inquiry-based science education. And the question I'd like to raise briefly in this short time is, did we succeed in the 2 main goals that we all had, I think? First, contribute to human development and the children we were working for. And did we contribute to more justice in education? So I would like to focus briefly on 3 questions. What did we learn from the past? What are the new challenges of today? And does this tell us somewhere to go for the future? We, of course, have not worked for the student immediately, but for the teachers, because we have the conviction that a teacher who is changed in his way of teaching, in his relation to science, can change along his career thousands of children. I always like to remember the Nobel lecture of Albert Camus when he was quoting his primary school teacher, Louis Germain, and praised him in front of the King of Sweden. That was very important. So the lesson from the past. Now, inquiry is not an entirely new idea. John Dewey had it almost more than a century ago. The object lesson came in France with the leçon de choses. Then great scientists developed this, Faraday, Jean Perrin, Francis Perrin, Louis Pasteur, all praised inquiry in science education. This was taken again as a new flame by Georges Charpak and many other scientists. The list to quote all of them would be too long. Some are in this room, like Fritz Hanne from South Africa, Bruce Alberts, who introduced in the Science Journal a special chronicle on science education, which has developed over the last years. Wei Yu, who undertook as Minister of Education in China 15 years ago, a deep testing pilot project on science education, which has bear fruit today since China has very recently introduced a reform of curriculum which says that there are 3 fundamentals: science, language, and mathematics. So, developing inquiry, we have learned, I think, 3 major things. The first one is, for a change, we need the scientific community. Those scientists, the one I name, and others, have played an essential role in mobilizing the ministries of education, the political forces. Second, we need the political side. We need the education authorities very badly. I was sorry not to be here when Jean-Michel Blanquer, our Minister of Education, spoke this morning. But the fact that Jean-Paul de Godemar was chairing the first session and has been in the various positions he had in the past, so supportive, was decisive for the development of IPSE in France. Let me mention the role of Michel Rocard when he was former Prime Minister of France, when he was a member of the European Parliament, and that after a brief lunch with Georges Charpak got convinced that EU had to do something for science education. And this started the large program which is still active at the European Commission. One message for the political bodies is that repeating, reading, writing, counting is essential, is short. I mean, this was the message of the creation of compulsory primary school at the end of the 19th century. And it has been very efficient in compulsory education in many countries. But today, to equip the young people of the 21st century, we need to add 1 verb to those 3: reading, writing, counting, reasoning. This is so critical for the future. And we have tried, without much success yet, to convince the public opinion and the political authorities in France that they have to adopt this new slogan, should I say, oriented to the future and guiding the action. There is a third ingredient which has, maybe it's less visible, but it has developed in the last 10 years or so. It's the role of neurosciences, cognitive sciences, on the vision we have of the development of the brain of a child from birth, essentially, or at school from age of 5 or 6, up to teenage and the age of adult. And those phases, which are now well studied, demonstrate to us how important is the exposure of the kid to a variety of experience, of feelings, of sensations, and understanding, and words. And so this is supporting with scientific basis, inquiry-based science education, and especially for poor children, for the ones who are deprived from this richness of language, who are deprived from the occasion of saying different things and talking to a variety of people. So these three aspects with all the networks which have developed have shown to us that there is a solid body of evidence that ipse is God, and this consensus is very important for the future. We have now, and we didn't have that 10 years ago, a number of studies of good quality to follow the evaluation of inquiry in schools. I just mentioned, for example, done at Smithsonian. We have here a representative of the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, laser i3 that you could find on the web, the details, which has followed for grade 1 to 8. So it's an extended cohort of students who has done this for 5 years, a longitudinal study on those.
There will be a special talk tomorrow afternoon about that.
Oh, okay. Some other. It's also interesting that to see that a country like Taiwan, who is now planning a deep reform of science education, is from the beginning associating to this reform a constant set of assessment tools. This was called by Win Harlan, this world-known specialist of primary school science education, and now it's interesting to see that a country use that. Probably we have a talk from Andrew Jen on that. But there is a but also, and we knew that, but we have learned much more about it. In the PISA result, it was shown that the question on inquiry, those 6 or 7 questions which were listed on the board in the previous talk, mention some criteria for practice of the teacher. And it's a declaration of students who says that their teacher had or didn't have the inquiry practice. Well, if you look more carefully at the analysis, it's clearly that those teachers do not practice, for most of them, inquiry. So the judgment of PISA on inquiry is based on an analysis done by the students on the teacher practice, which shows fairly clearly that they don't practice inquiry. So the fact that the result is so negative is not really surprising, but it might be, in the context of PISA, very dangerous for the development of inquiry. When you read, surprising as it may seem, there is no education system in which pupils who have reported frequent exposure to education based on an inquiry approach score higher in science. So there is the score issue, what it measures, and there is also the teacher issue, how are they measured? We should be watchful on that. On the other hand, La Main à la Pâte knows perfectly that there is a considerable international demand on training of teachers or trainers of teachers and so on. We have this year, for the 8th year, this international seminar which gathered 50% from all over the world, except Europe, and who come from over 30 nations, and some of them are in the room today, and who discuss practice and this teacher training where they have to discover science by doing it. This is the secret. It works, and it has to be done. So in those 2 decades, I think we have achieved 4 essential points. One, we have built a common language among scientists, educators, and political authorities on IPSE. This is very important. We know what we speak about, and we have some evaluation to discuss it. Second, we have built a strong support by scientists, academies, and I could only refer to the talk on IAP by Krishna Lal this morning, which demonstrated to you how intense the involvement of science academies has been. The America's network, North and South, YANAS, has just published, it's being released in a few days, I think, a summary of the action over the continent, especially Latin America, of those academies for IPSE. It's absolutely amazing. And here one of the secrets is continuity. Of course, education is a long-term process. You can't change it just like that. And this doesn't satisfy sometimes the politicians, of course. It's a long-term process, and who is in a better position to carry this long-term objective than a science academy, which is permanent. The third point we have learned also is that it's possible to conjugate, to balance between the universality of science, which allows a common language so easily, which refers so easily to another universal factor, which is the curiosity of children, to balance that with the diversity of implementation, depending on the countries, the culture, the history of education, the teacher training, and so on and so forth. This year I was in 3 countries, very different, Pakistan, Sudan, and Iran. And in each of those countries, I gave lectures, visited schools, talked to fellow scientists, and so on. And I could measure this kind of balance in action in planning the education. And finally, one of the results of those decades is that today we have a fantastic set of tools for science education that we didn't have years ago. Now the question remains, is science education sufficiently done, or is it even needed for the 1 billion of children in the world who have poor education, and among them 150 million do not have any schooling at all? Is it adequate to plan that? And the second question, this is a question of justice, of course, and the second question is human development. Are we really contributing to human development today? Now, the challenge of today, I should say the challenge of tomorrow, is that we enter a new era. This is called Anthropocene. So my next point is, are there new challenges which are coming due to this new era, which is, of course, global? And I would like to quote 2 persons, Irina Bokova. We saw her at the UNESCO meeting with that Olivier shown. She gave the foreword of this fantastic book on, which is the report Education for People on the Planet, 2016. We must fundamentally change the way we think about education and its role in human development. More than ever, education has a responsibility to foster the right type of skills, attitudes, and behaviors. We can no longer, with climate change, do business as usual. With Anthropocene, we can no longer do school as usual. And this is part of our responsibility because science is at the heart of the change. Einstein, was quoted already, said, problems cannot be solved with the same mindset that created them. And of course, one of the goals of IPSE is to change the mindset. We're changing it, but how and for which purpose? So I think there is a challenge for IPSE in the future, in the next 10 years, which are quite different than the ones we had 20 years ago. And I will mention 5 challenges. The first is topics, which are not disciplines, because they are, and this was said before by our friend Fouad Shafiki, they are completely transversal to the classical disciplines: climate, health, computer science. They all require social science, which are not part of a physics curriculum, obviously. Now, this makes a very complex system and probably much too rich to be enclosed in a curriculum. So how could we handle that? Now, thoughts have begun on this under the name of big ideas. What are, for this Anthropocene change, the big ideas that science conveys, has nourished, created sometimes, and developed, which are essential to give to kids, say, K9, something like that, in compulsory education, so that they can find their way and understand the world they will live in. This is a work to be done. And I could add the list. I could have added artificial intelligence, for instance, to the list. So topics. Second point, methods. Do we have to change methods with digital learning? That's a question. With instant communication? This morning I heard at the radio that a school near Paris, not too far, had put on Facebook a request for receiving postcards from all over the world. And they were expecting 20 or 30 postcards. They will receive, during this week, 20,000 postcards. This is an example of the connection that a primary school in a suburb of France, a small city, can have immediately with the world. So the question was, what will you do with those cards? And they were saying, we'll display them on the wall of the room and the class and then on the street, etc., etc. So methods have to evolve. The public, of course. And this is back to the issue of justice. We have had the public of normal schools, should I say. But today, do we face the issue of migrants and refugees? 60 million refugees in the last 5 years, half of them below the age of 15. A large fraction living in camps. Do these kids will ever have science education? Can we do something for that? Isn't that a new challenge for us? Fourth point, the pedagogy. We have focused our effort on teachers, and that was right, I think. Maybe there is an inflection to make students agents of change for the future, to empower them to the point that they can contribute at their level, of course, and consider that knowledge leads to action. And of course, for questions like sustainable development, this is essential. There are plenty of experiments in that direction. Probably the inquiry philosophy should include them and develop them. And my last point, which is connected, is the opening of school to community, to parents. There are many detailed aspects to explore in that region. So I'm coming to the end. Yeah, I conclude. I think this opens for Sesame great directions. I hope Sesame will succeed. I am especially pleased to see this meeting and to thank Odile Mackey and all the people who worked with her, because at the Rome AEMASE 1 conference, I had a keynote lecture, and I concluded it by saying, oh, I have a dream. Maybe I shouldn't say it, but I tell you, this is an ambitious proposal based on ICTP success. Would a country or an organization consider as a worthwhile goal the undertaking of the establishment of a permanent center for teachers and allocate the necessary resources? That's exactly where we stand today. It was 3 years ago. Congratulations, Odile.